Hello and welcome back for another VMK in the game development series. In this VMK, we're going to use the GUIs that we created in the previous set of VMKs, and we're going to incorporate them into our game engine. We're now transitioning from game engine type programming to more user interface type programming. So we're starting to near the end of the OpenGL game engine series. But there's still a few videos yet to come. Before we get started inside of Visual Studio, let's go into PaintShop Pro and just refresh our memories on what we have here. This is the structure that we're going to be aiming towards. You've already seen this diagram many times before. When the application is started, we start up over here. We go into Game State Starting. This is where the splash screen is rendered. After 7 seconds or a key is pressed, we currently go into this game state menu. And this is where we're doing all of our testing for all of the GUI elements that we are designing. Now what we're going to do is actually make the linkages between all of these items. And these linkages are going to allow us to move or transition from the menu state into the option state, and then from here we can go back and so on. So we're going to be basically adding in all these arrows into the logic of our game engine. So to start off, let's go into our code and make sure that we've already defined all these different states that we're going to be transitioning through. So inside of here, we defined all the transition states inside of core.h. So if we go under game engine, header files, core.h, in here, if we scroll through, okay, here they are, game state. So we have none, starting, menu, loading, play, and pause, and stop. We are missing a few, so let's just go in here and update this list so that we have options as well as pause options. Now that we have this updated, we can go back into our game OpenGL class, and all of these are going to be handled directly inside of the frame function. Every time through our loop, this is where we're going to go into. So we update the time, and then depending on which state we're in, we're going to go into this update game function, this show menu option, or this show intro. Well, we need to add in a few more cases in here to handle all the game states that we're going to be creating now. We already have game state menu here, but we need to add in the option menus. So right above, we're going to add case game state pause options, game state pause, game state options, and then we also have game state menu. We're stacking all of these case statements together like so that if any of these are the current state of the game, we're going to call show menu. And then inside show menu, we're going to make a decision as to which of these we're going to be handling. We also need to include a new case here for whenever we're in the game state loading state. So right at the bottom here, just add case game state loading. And we're going to call a function called show loading, which we're going to write in this VMK. One thing I should mention here is the order in which that I've listed these case statements is kind of important. Most likely, the user will be playing the game, which means that they're going to be going into this state. Because of that, I've placed it first so that when the program is running, it doesn't have to go searching through all these other cases to find this specific case. So it's the first one. The next most important thing, or the most common thing people will do, is go into the options menu. So I've placed them second, and then starting will only happen once, which is at the very beginning, as well as loading. Loading will only ever happen after you've transition from the main menu to actually start playing. So it's at the bottom. So the order here is sort of in the order of importance, or the most used, that the user will see. It's not a major detail to worry about, but it is something that I did put a little bit of thought into. So if you're wondering why they're in this order, that's the reasoning for it. Now, we don't need to make any changes into the show menu function because the way we structured the GUI engine is it's going to know how to render all the appropriate items on the screen depending on this game state. So there's no changes needed to make here. However, we do need to add this function. So let's go into our game OpenGL header and let's add it in. Right here we have show menu, so right below that, let's add show loading. And going into here, we have show menu, so right below him, let's add the following code. Again, we need to clear the screen, so we call GL clear, And then we set up our model view matrix to use the ortho projection matrix. And then we're going to create a new function inside of the scene class called render loading. And this is going to have sort of a little screen that pops up to let the user know that we're doing some loading. We need render post right after here so that whatever we do inside of here is actually rendered to the screen. And then finally, we're going to go and call a function called loading level data. And this is going to be responsible for doing all the loading required for the specific level that the user is about to start. After this is done, then we're going to set the game state to game state play so that the user will automatically jump into the game. So what we're doing here is we're inside of this state, we're going to render an item on the screen, show it, and then while it's visible on the screen, all we're going to be doing is loading resources. After everything's loaded, we automatically jump into our game state play so that the user can now start interacting. While this is loading, the user won't be able to do anything. Overall, the game state is paused from the user's point of view. However, it is doing work in the background. Alright, so we're going to have to add these two new functions into the scene class. But to keep things simple, what I'm going to do is just comment these two out for now, because we'll implement the loading level in a separate VMK, because there is a little bit of work that we're going to need to do. In this VMK, I'm going to focus just to get the structure of the overall flow of transitioning from one state to another. We're not going to put in all the details in each of these options just yet. Alright, so this guy is done. Let's go and compile him, make sure everything is still fine. Okay, so the first thing we should now do is go in and populate everything that's going to be showing up inside of this GUI state menu. To do that, we can go into our scene class, and inside the initialize function, scene initialize, this is where we would go in and test all of the GUI items. So now let's remove all these things that we're not going to be using and replace them with stuff that we're actually going to be using. On the main menu, we're going to have three buttons. There's going to be a quit button. So here you see I specified GUI ID main button quit. I've positioned it, and then I've set up the texture coordinates accordingly. I've associated it with the game state menu. Then we have an options button. This one we're going to be able to press to go and change some options for the game. And here I specify that this is the main button options. And again, filling in some textures and then adding it in. And finally, we have a start button. The start button is going to actually let you start playing the game whenever it's pressed. So we have main button start new. And again, loading in some textures and then adding it into this GUI control group. So let's go and compile this and see what happens when we go and run it. We're skipping over the splash screen and stuff like that, so we should just jump straight into our game state menu when the program begins. And there we go. So we have our three options: start, options, and quit. But you notice now that when I press these buttons, we can highlight them and stuff because that's the way that GUI controls work, but actually nothing is happening. There is no code written just yet that says when I click this, go to wherever I'm supposed to go. And when I click quit, it doesn't actually quit the game because we haven't written that code. But we do have the layout and the buttons actually sort of graphically on the screen. So let's go and add some more functionality now. The only time we know whether a GUI element is pressed is when we go into our GUI check hotspots function. So in here, we've got the code already written that lets us check to see if a button is pressed, and then by calling this check hotspot function, what happens is the GUI element is actually updated to whatever state it needs to be in so that when it's rendered, it renders correctly. Now what we want to do is actually get the return value from this check hotspots function, because it's going to return to us which GUI element is pressed, and then using that information we can then decide what to do. To do that, at the top we're going to include a new variable here. It's going to be a GUI ID, and I just called it ID here, and this function is going to return this ID number to us. Once we get this ID number, we need to write some logic into here. Most of the time, this ID number is going to return to us GUI ID none because your cursor is not over top of any GUI element. So we don't want to do anything if that's the case. We're just going to go around this if statement and skip it altogether. However, if the ID number is not equal to GUI none, that means that the cursor is currently over top of a specific GUI element. So we need to go into here and make some more decisions. At this point, we're still not sure which specific GUI control this guy's returning to us. You'll notice that the check hotspots function, we're actually calling this one right here, which returns to us a GUI ID. With this GUI ID, we're going to have an ID number that tells us specifically which one is being pressed, but we don't know what type of GUI this control is yet. So what we need to do is first figure that out, because once we know that, then we can make some smarter decisions as to what to do next. What we do in here is we take this control, this current control, and check its type. If it's equal to GUI button and the mouse button is currently pressed, that means that the user pressed on a specific button. So this is where we're going to add in some logic to figure out what we should do depending on which button was pressed. Down below, we're going to have a bunch of other statements a little later on, which is going to be handling our cases for all the different types of GUI controls, like sliders, text items, and other things like that. But for now, let's just work with the GUI button. So because we know that our GUI element is a button, what we're going to do is take the control that we're currently working with and cast it to be a GUI button. We do this because all the functionality that we need is specific to the GUI button class. So we'll need to use pButton from now on rather than this generic GUI control which is returned from this container. Also up here we should go in and add GUI button pointer, and it's going to be called pButton. And let's just clean that up a little. Alright. Now, we know we've pressed the button, and we have the current button that is pressed right here for us to use. Next thing we need to do is make a decision based on the specific button that is pressed. Because you'll remember that back inside core.h, we created all these ID numbers, and all these ID numbers are with respect to all the different controls we're going to have. Well, these are the first three that we're working with right now. And depending on which of these three are pressed, we're going to have to make different decisions. Quit will actually quit the game. Options will put you into another game state menu called options. And start menu will actually put you into that state where loading will happen and then you're going to jump right into the game. So each of these are going to do something a little bit different. So in here, we're going to take the ID number and then make some decisions accordingly. So if we're in game state menu button start new, if that's what's being pressed, what we're going to do is we're going to set up our game state to be game state loading. This will automatically put us into that loading state where everything gets loaded for us. We need to unselect the button, so we're going to take set pressed, set it up to false, and we're also going to change set over and set that equal to false, and then we break out. I'm going to show you why we do this in a second, but for now just leave it as it is. If we're inside of the main button's option, which is being pressed, then we're going to set the game state to be options. We're going to again take the pressed state, make it false, and set the over state and make it false. And lastly, if we're pressing the quit button, then we take the user settings m_b quit parameter and set it up to be true. And this will automatically quit our game because of the way that we've already structured our code. And again, we're going to take the set pressed, set it up to be false, and set over and set that equal to false. Okay, so this should add the required functionality for us to be able to navigate through our menu system. Let me just add in some comments here so it's easier to identify what all these brackets are for. I think that's good enough for now. Alright, let's build this and try it out. Okay, so here we go. If I click the Start New Game, we should go into the loading state, which is then going to throw us directly into our play state. And we see that we've gone into some mode and nothing seemed to happen. So there seems to be a bug there. Let's quit that and try the next one. Options currently will put us into the option state where we have nothing to render, so we should see a black screen. And so that looks like it's probably working correctly. And the last one, the quit state, if we press this, we should actually quit the game. And it did quit. So one out of the three seems to be working perfectly, or maybe two out of the three if this one's working perfectly as well. Let's just debug this one, make sure everything here is working correctly. If we go back into Game OpenGL, we're going to be going into Show Loading, which is going to clear the thing, render, and then change the state to be play. Let's make sure that this is actually happening correctly. We'll put a breakpoint into here and run our program. If I hit this, we go into Show Loading. That's good. So we're going in here, we're clearing the screen, we're rendering, we're changing the state to be play, and then what happens? We're back inside a frame. That's good. So let's put a breakpoint here and continue running. So this is the next time through our frame function. Let's see what's going to happen now. It should go into game state play. So press F10 and you see that it didn't go into game state play. It went back into game state menu. So something is missing here, that it didn't actually set the game state play to be, or it didn't actually set the game state to be play. It instead did something else and didn't take the play state. So let's quit out of this and figure out what's going on. Okay, after some digging around, I finally figured out what was wrong here. If you take a look at Show Menu, you'll see that what we do is we set up the GL clear color to be black. So we use 0, 0, 0, and then 1 for the alpha channel. And we call GL clear, which clears the screen, and then we continue on working. Now, if we go into frame again, and if we switch over to be game state play, we're going to call update game. And inside here, you see that we're going to do some initialization. We call render pre, and inside here we call GL clear. But we never reset the background clear color to whatever it should be. So we're still using black. We actually do go into this function here. If we put up a breakpoint inside of update game, like so, and we run the program, notice what happens. We're not inside update game because we're not updating the game. If we go into options, we go into the options menu, and then we're stuck, so we can't do anything here. However, if we run the game and then click on Start a New Game, notice it does go into Update Game. So we are actually updating the game state correctly. However, what we're displaying on the screen is not being rendered correctly because we never updated the background color. If you look really closely, you can't see anything because everything's drawn over top of a black background. If you had a different colored grid on the ground, you would be able to see it most likely. So to fix this, all we need to do is right before we call render pre, set up a new color for the background. And what we've been using up till now is white, so let's just set up GL clear color to be white here, 1, 1, 1, 1 all the way across. And now when we go and run the code, I think it should start working properly. Okay, so there we go. We started the game. There is no loading screen right now because we've just commented that stuff out, but we are able to go directly into here. And that's it. So let's quit out of that, and let's see what's left here. According to the flowchart, we start here, we go into our menu. From the menu, we can now go through the game state loading directly into game state play. And then once in here, we haven't added in this stuff yet. We'll do that in the following VMK. And from here, we can go into game state options, but we have no way of coming back. So let's add this linkage here, and then that'll be it for this VMK. Going back into our code, we need to load in a GUI element that will be our button that allows us to move back. to do that, let's go back into Scene, and inside of Initialize, we'll need to scroll down here, and right after all these items here that we've added in previously, let's add in a new button. So up here we're specifying GUI ID options button back, and then we're setting up the textures and adding this specific button into game state options. Okay, let's go and build this and run it. So initially we don't see that options button because it's not part of game state menu. Only everything that's attached to game state menu shows up on the screen. If we hit the options button, notice that the back button appears and those three buttons disappear. This is the way we've structured our GUI control items. So we are now inside of the options menu. There's nothing in here other than the back button, but notice that when we press the back button, nothing happens because we haven't made the linkage backwards yet. That's easy enough to do now that we've already created our one class to handle the check hotspots. As soon as you press that button, again, you're going to go into here, and because you're a button, you're going to go into here, and all we need to do is add an extra switch statement to handle the case of when the back button is pressed. Okay, so here's that case. We take the user settings, game state, and we set it back to be game state menu, and then we unselect the button and unselect the overstate. So now we should be able to go from the main menu to the options menu and then back again. Let's test that out. So here we are in the main menu. We hit options, we're in the options menu, and we hit the back button and we're back inside of the main menu. So we can go back and forth as many times as we like now. Now that we have this back and forth functioning properly, let me show you why we need to do this work here. Let's say that the options button, we don't reset it to be false. Notice what happens. We're in here, everything's working fine. We can highlight over top of this. We click the button, we've gone into the options menu. So here we are in the options menu, we set up some options. Now we go back. We click the back button, and notice what is happening here. The options button is still highlighted. It's highlighted because it was highlighted before and we never reset the state of it. And now, if we go highlight over top of it, you notice that it doesn't toggle like the start button does. It's because our logic only works if the button is highlighted and pressed. Right now the button is not being pressed, so nothing is getting updated. If I click on it again, we still go into here and we can go back, and now you notice that it reset itself. So to fix the way that the button updates itself, you have to manually unselect it and deselect that there's a button over top of it, because there is no way for it to know that you've moved to another screen and there should be some sort of extra logic involved. So that's why you need to do this and make sure you deselect it and you turn off the overstate for that button any time that it's pressed. You only have to do this with these navigation buttons because you're moving from one screen to another. Once you've moved to another screen, we can't update that original button state because we're no longer controlling it. When you have buttons on the same screen that when you click and they change states, we don't have to do all of this work because this work is just sort of a special case, you could say. Alright, so that's it for now, I think. Let me just recompile and make sure that everything's still working here. We can go into the game, yep, and if we quit out of it, everything seems to work fine and we're still getting return code 0. Okay, so come back for the next VMK where we're going to tackle the game state options state. We're going to pre-populate every GUI element that goes into here and add in the functionality so that as you change these items, the game engine will update itself to allow for these changes to take place.